celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I wish to welcome you to the fourth part in a 6-week series entitled The Great Mysteries of Our Time. We're very fortunate to have on the program today an internationally known, a very, very famous expert on the issue of near-death experiences. I welcome to the program Dr. Raymond A. Moody, Jr. Many of you have heard about his work, and he became really well-known and celebrated for his book entitled Life After Life. Our guest holds BA, MA, and PhD degrees from the University of Virginia, and later went to the Medical College of Georgia and received his MD degree in 1976, and then served his residency at the University of Virginia Medical School. Our guest also has written other books. Included is the book entitled Reflections on Life After Life, and another book, The Light Beyond. Dr. Moody, we've had a lot of guests on our program, and you're certainly one of the most special guests we've had, and we're delighted to have you here with us.
Thanks, Tony. It's good to be here.
And to join me today and question our guests on the issue of near-death experiences is Steve Schink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I will ask Steve to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Dr. Moody, could you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in near-death experiences?
When I was a young person, I was raised in a family that was not explicitly religious, and I attended church occasionally, but it was not a department of life that I ever took seriously. And I just sort of grew up assuming that death was the obliteration of consciousness. But I have always been very curious about the human mind, even from the time I was a very young child. But my basic approach to life had been that scientific inquiry was what I was interested in terms of learning about the mind and how it works. And in 1965, when I was an undergraduate student of philosophy at the University of Virginia, one of my professors told me about a psychiatrist there in Charlottesville, Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at that time, who had had a profound experience when he was pronounced dead some years before. And because I'm very curious about consciousness, I was really interested to hear this story, and I learned about it. But since at that time I was absolutely convinced all my life at that point that death was just the cessation of all consciousness, and yet I heard this very remarkable story from a man who was obviously quite reliable. But hearing something like that in a void, of course, you just have no idea what to do with it, so I just really didn't think about it much at all. That was in 1965, as I said, and 4 years later, after I'd gotten my PhD in philosophy, I happened to be teaching at that time at East Carolina University in the Department of Philosophy. And one day after class, in which I had been talking about Plato's Phaedo, which ostensibly deals with the question of life after death, but I had been trying to get the students to focus on the issue of how Plato presents his arguments and his so-called theory of forms in that dialogue. But after this class, a young student came up and said, "Dr. Moody, I wish we could talk about life after death in this class." And I thought that that was sort of a quaint thing to be asking in the 20th century. So I said, "Well, why are you interested in that?" And he said, "Because about a year ago I was in a bad accident and my doctors said I died. And I had an experience which has totally changed my life, and I haven't had anybody to talk about it with." Well, obviously, at that point, my curiosity was aroused, so I invited this young man to come into my office, and he told me an account which was identical to what I had heard from Dr. Ritchie 4 years before. And at that point, I remember making the realization that if I had obviously, if I had come across 2 cases of this just by coincidence, there had to be more. And so I assumed at that point that there must be a phenomenon that was at least not terribly rare, and which had not been documented. So I became very interested in this, and to make a long story short, obviously when I went to medical school, I had the opportunity to interview lots of patients after they had been revived following cardiac arrest. And very rapidly I began to see that, in fact, there is a common pattern of experience which occurs to individuals who are on the brink of death.
Well, there are lots of questions I'm eager to ask, but I'm going to let Tony pursue a line of questioning here first. The one thing I do want to do is maybe it would be helpful, certainly would be to me, to know what the clinical definition of death is. These people that have these experiences, has the heart stopped? Did they stop breathing? Has all brain activity ceased? What's the medical profession call death that people have actually come back from?
Well, of course, what we have to remember here, obviously, is that death is, by definition, the state from which one doesn't return. So these were people who were on the brink of death. Many of them had actually been declared dead. Some cases their death certificates had been written out. And the criteria on which this was assigned was just the regular clinical signs of death. Cessation of heartbeat and respiration. In some cases the skin temperature was cold. In some cases dilated pupils. And then for one reason or another, sometimes accountable, sometimes we can explain and understand why these people were revived. In other cases that we've looked into, it really seems to be a mystery as to how they could possibly have recovered.
From a medical point of view, is it possible to have absolutely no brain activity and be alive?
From the medical point of view, and from any point of view, I would say that the discussion of the flat brain wave is really kind of misleading, because in fact occasionally under certain circumstances you can get an apparently flat EEG tracing, and yet the person can still be revived, specifically in cases of hypothermia or intoxication by barbiturates. But that really doesn't mean that there's no brain activity. What the EEG is not a very reliable instrument. I mean, it's first of all, it's really hellish to have to put one of those things on, and you know the electrodes are always coming off. And I think in any clinical emergency, there's not often that it's used. Even then, you see, what it's measuring is electrical activities that's close to the scalp. And it doesn't measure electrical activity that's going on deeper within the brain.
In introducing the program, Dr. Moody, I indicated that you certainly were an author and also, it's obvious, a lecturer around the country, and you've written these books, and they continue to sell in large numbers. And here at our program, while you're on campus, a lot of books were selling from our local bookstore. From all of that, you have interviewed many, many people that has resulted in those books. I believe you indicated that it's been over 3,000 people.
About 3,000 people.
Yes. I know one thing that the viewers are wondering about, because on campus they were saying, and so the TV audience is doing the same thing. Would you please describe to us some of those subjects, the kind of experiences that they commonly shared in those near-death experiences?
Basically, there seems to be a common pattern of this pretty much all over the world, regardless of the culture or the age of the patient, or within broad limits the event that brought them close to death. Basically what they tell us is that they undergo an experience in which, from their point of view, they seem to leave their physical bodies. They watch their physical bodies from up above. They can relate to us in great detail the events of the resuscitation attempt from that perspective. After a while, in this so-called out-of-the-body state, they realize that although they can see and understand perfectly what's happening, what the doctors and nurses and others are saying, no one seems to be able to see or to hear them. So they undergo a certain sense of what I would call the turning inward of the sense of identity. They tell us that they become aware of this isolation and the feeling that this experience that they're undergoing is something related to what we call death. And it's at this point that these more transcendental parts of the near-death experience that one hears about begin to take place. They tell us that that first of all, that the experience they undergo defies our ability to put it into linguistic expression, that there aren't really any words to convey it. And yet within those limits, they pretty much agree that they seem to go through an enclosure of some sort. They may call it a portal or a passageway or a tunnel or a window, and that they come out on the other side into an incredibly bright light, far brighter than anything that we have ever experienced while we're alive, and yet in no way is it uncomfortable. They say that as they go into this light, they feel surrounded by love and peace. They may report to us that they see relatives or friends of theirs who have already died, who seem to be there to meet them and to help them through this transition. And they undergo what we call panoramic memory, in which they say that all of the events of their life are sort of displayed around them in a full-color, three-dimensional panorama, which they witness instantaneously, as it were.
And some of them hear music too, do they?
Music, and then they say that at some point they have to go back. They say that they are very reluctant to return. And of course, most interestingly from the psychiatric point of view is that these patients undergo profound changes in their lives due to these experiences. They say that they focus after this on the importance of love and human relationships, seems to be their central focus in life, and that they essentially lose their fear of death.
I think you explained in the lecture today so clearly why that their lives may change. Would you take our audience through the way that when they're having this experience, they can look back at events in their life, or they can also look on the other side at the consequences that it has for other people? If you'd explain that.
Well, basically, they tell us that in this panorama, it doesn't take place in time as we are now experiencing it, but that rather everything is there instantaneously in the form of a full-color, three-dimensional panorama. And they say that when you undergo this, you don't witness the events of your life from the perspective that you had when you were going through them. Rather, you watch yourself as a third person. And they say if you see yourself doing a certain action, then when that action results, you become the feelings, to put it in those terms, of the persons with whom you've interacted. And hence, if you see yourself doing an unloving action to one of your fellow human beings, when that action results, you feel the sad feelings that you've brought about in the life of that person. Or when you see yourself doing a loving action to someone, then you feel the good feelings. And so for this reason, they say that they become quite aware that the main thing, the most important thing we can be doing while we're alive is to cultivate loving relationships with our fellow humans.
So you can not only, in another dimension that's hard to put in the language that we have, you can see the sequences of things you've done, but you can also see the consequences.
The consequences, yeah. I had a man from London who had been an engineer who attempted suicide. Put this in a very interesting analogy. He said that if you regard this panorama as like the still surface of a pond, and each action that you do is like the point on the pond where a pebble that you flip into the pond intersects, and you see the ripples coming out. Then he said, as you can see these ripples diverge from that point, then as they impinge on other people, then you see the secondary ripples, going off from that point as well. So that the people come back from this with a tremendous sense of the connectedness of us all of us human beings.
Sounds like it creates a real awareness of responsibility of one's actions toward others.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tremendous sense, and many of them say exactly that, and that it gives them a real sense of urgency to come back and to use this time that we have to their best benefit.
Steve Sheen.
Dr. Moody, I don't think I've ever met anyone who is both a medical doctor and a doctor of philosophy. I wonder how you react to what you've learned in your studies as a philosopher on the one hand and as a doctor on the other. Any differences there that you...
Well, as a matter of fact, Steve, one thing that I have learned from this is that the education really doesn't seem to help very much with it. I mean, in the sense that this is stuff that is mind-boggling in a way, I think, quite beyond the capacity of what we know as human knowledge now really fully to understand. But within those terms, what I would say is that I think in terms of how it's affected me as a person, until the time I was about 22 or 20 or so years old, it never entered my mind anything other than that when you die, there's just a wipeout of your consciousness, that there's a nothingness. That was how I always believed. And yet, as I have listened now to these many, many, many hundreds of people who've been through this, it sunk into me in a way that these people really do get a glimpse of some other level of reality. Now, I'd also believe very firmly that is not a matter of scientific proof, that the near-death experience does not constitute scientific evidence that we live after we die. But I think I have a right, after having talked with all these people, to have an emotional and a subjective impact as well. And in my judgment, these people really do get a glimpse of what's always been called the life after death. And it's a judgment in which my colleagues, by and large, who have investigated these experiences, and indeed now we have physicians and psychologists and psychiatrists literally all over the world who've looked into this. By and large, all of them have arrived at that same kind of subjective response to it that I have.
As part of this series of discussions that we've been having about the great mysteries of our time, I've listened to some other people say that they have no way of interesting science in a pursuit of Bigfoot, for instance, that to go to a scientist and say, this is a phenomenon that I believe in and you should be studying it, well, there's just no interest on the part of most scientists in pursuing that.
Yeah.
This is not the case, apparently, with near-death experiences. There is a group of people who are actively studying that experience.
Well, I would say that the difference with this, of course, is that primarily the people who've been looking into this are psychologists and physicians, and whatever one makes of this experience ontologically, whether one concludes that it's hallucination due to residual brain activity, or whether one believes that it's a vision of life after death, that it is nonetheless a clinical reality, in the sense that we know from numerous studies that quite a large proportion of patients who are resuscitated following cardiac arrest will have something like that happen to them. And hence, it becomes important for clinicians to know about these experiences so that they can allow the patient to talk about it and give them a sympathetic ear, and to reassure them that they're not alone, that a lot of people who go through cardiac arrest come back with this report, and also to reassure the relatives of the person that this person is not mentally ill, that it's quite common, and to sort of prepare the family for the personality changes that will be coming. And so that it has not found interest, I think, specifically within science, but certainly within clinical studies, which is a different thing rather than the scientific pursuit of knowledge for itself. In clinical situation, you're really looking at knowledge so that you can help somebody with it.
As a non-scientist, the one aspect of the experience that you've described that would seem to me that scientists might be able to examine with some objectivity and some clear or some hope of a clear resolution is this business of being able to very accurately describe the events that have happened when their eyes may be tightly closed and they're clinically, or at least apparently dead. Is there any explanation of how that happens?
Well, I must say it's the part of the near-death experience that I just don't pay that much attention to, because I can't imagine what that means. I do know for sure that this is very common. It's happened in cases in which I've been involved in the resuscitation, where these people actually do seem to be able to tell us things about the resuscitation, even things that were going on in another part of the hospital entirely, while from our point of view they were there lying inert in the resuscitation room. And this is highly puzzling, but I think it's more complicated than one might imagine, to imagine how to set up a situation to study this. For one thing, if you think about it, we have to get informed consent in doing studies. And then how would you get informed consent since you don't know in advance who's going to have a cardiac arrest? And you know, it probably you could raise objections that to give any patient who comes into the hospital routinely this form that says, if you had a cardiac arrest while you're here, would it be okay for us to study in certain ways?
Wouldn't put the patient in the best frame of mind, I suppose.
Right. Plus, I think, you know, in that situation, it's really a clinical emergency rather than a laboratory type setting. And those situations are crowded enough anyway. It's hard to imagine in that situation how investigators might come in and do some experiment that would not have the potential of interfering with the clinical thing. So I think it would really be a very hard thing to study in a systematic way, although, as you say, you know, when you first think about it, it would seem that it could, but I think in the practical reality of it, it's probably very difficult.
You'd indicate also to the audience today that George Gallup in the 1980s, probably that is the most respected firm in the world, maybe in poll taking, that he got involved in this, and that over 8 million Americans have had some type
over
of
8 million American adults as of the early 80s he judged, and he said that he was startled by that result, but nonetheless quite confident on the basis of their study that was correct. And subsequently to that, we've learned that in addition to the adult population, which he studied, that very young children even have near-death experiences when they are resuscitated. So we know that an enormous number of people, granted that in industrialized societies all over the world, this technique of cardiopulmonary resuscitation is now widely practiced. We know that an enormous number of people have had this experience.
Another thing that you found in your research, as you've interviewed so many of the subjects, that they have indicated to you that when they were going through this process and seeing the light and the music and so forth, that they were in many cases given a choice whether to come back or not.
Yeah.
Could you share that with our audience?
Yeah, what they generally say is that toward the end of this, that they are told that sometimes they're told that you have to go back, it's not your time to die yet, you've got things left to do. Other times they tell us that they're given a choice, that they can go on with this experience or return to the life that they have been leading. And it's very interesting that universally what they say is that at this point, that for themselves they would have chosen to go on with this experience, but that they chose to go back, and the most common reason is that they had children left to raise. And they said, for myself, I chose to go back. I would have stayed, but for my kids, I chose to go back. And the only exceptions to those are a few cases where I've had people who were in helping professions, one case a nurse, another a social worker, and they both said at this point that they wanted to go back because they had committed themselves to a life of helping others. But it always seems to be for others.
Another intriguing result that from the studies that I hear you talking about has to do with attempted suicides, and when those have not been successful, but they had a near-death experience. What is the issue about future attempts at suicide?
Well, interestingly enough, one study conducted by Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Connecticut Medical School. Bruce is an emergency psychiatrist, and he has studied quite a number of people who had near-death experiences as a result of suicide attempts. And what he has found is that if you compare a group of patients who did not have a near-death experience when they attempted suicide with the group of patients who did have a near-death experience under those circumstances, and follow those two groups of patients over a period of time, you find that although the patients who did not have a near-death experience continue as a group to have a high rate at subsequent attempts at suicide, the patients who had the near-death experience had an essentially zero rate of any further attempts at self-destruction. And when asked why this is, they tell us that the near-death experience revealed to them that life is a very precious gift and that we are here to learn things, and that it's impossible for us anyway to escape from it by attempting to kill ourselves, because the problems that we're trying to resolve are still there, unresolved.
Steve Sheik.
I'm curious, of the total population of people who have had, who have been near death and been revived, what percentage have near-death experience, what percentage don't?
Due to the fact that there are several different kinds of studies that have looked at different populations, there's a slight variance on this, but all of the studies tend to be on the surprisingly high end. And the study that was done by Dr. Ken Ring at the University of Connecticut, and also the study that was done by Dr. Michael Sabom, a cardiologist at the University of Florida Medical School in Gainesville, it was about 35%, as I recall, of the patients who had come very close to death. When more strict criteria are used, in one case of Dr. Fred Schoonmaker, who's chief of cardiovascular medicine at St. Luke's Hospital in Denver, who studied primarily patients who had actually undergone a full-blown cardiac arrest from which they were resuscitated. He believed that, he said that after his study going over several years in which he interviewed over 2,500 people that he had resuscitated, he found that it was actually about 60%.
Do have the experience.
Mm-hmm. And all of us who've looked into this are really startled by how common it is among patients who recover from close calls with death. Now, in many cases, one doesn't hear about it simply because this is a very personal experience, and sometimes they realize that others will think that they're out of their minds or whatever, so they're not very likely to talk about it unless they can tell that the person with them is very sympathetic and will listen.
Dr. Moody, too, when someone has this near-death experience, in some cases they're involved in this at a longer period, some for 1 minute and 2 minutes and 3 minutes, etc. The length of time that a person is in this state, does that affect the near-death experience?
Yes, it seems to. People who, for instance, have a shorter cardiac arrest will be more likely to report just 2 or 3 of these things, say like getting out of their bodies and watching from above and maybe seeing a tunnel, whereas patients who undergo extremely lengthy cardiac arrests, 20 minutes, and I know that these figures are going to be startling, but 2 hours, even 3 days, in one case of a man that I know, a good friend of mine, George Rodinaya, who was actually put in the refrigerator box in a morgue over the weekend and then revived on the following Monday. That these people with the more lengthy cardiac arrest tend to get into much more in detail and more involved experiences.
I'm so sorry we don't have more time. We have so many questions that were left unasked and unanswered. You have been so informative, and we thank you for all the time you've given to our campus, our community, and to this program.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. Raymond A. Moody, Jr., who is an expert on near-death experiences, and I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we will do part 5 of the 6-week series on the topic, The Great Mysteries of Our Time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.